Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Lion, the Way, and the War, where we discuss Jesus, His church, and the spiritual battle that surrounds us all. My name is Craig Allison, and I'll be your host. All right, joining me on today's podcast is Dr. John Young, Christian, husband, author, father, speaker, lecturer, professor, got his PhD. I said that. I don't know if I should have put that in a different order. I'm thinking, okay, Christian first, husband, father. Yeah. PhD in history from University of Alabama, as well as also from Alabama, a Master of Arts in history. And you got your bachelor's undergrad degree in political science. You are a current associate professor at the Turner School of Theology at Amherst University, and you've instructed at Mars Hill Bible School, Lincoln Christian University, the University of Alabama, currently residing in Florence, Alabama. And you've been married 11 years this coming November, soon to be 4-year-old, and you've got one on the way.
In November also.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
Yeah.
It's good to be here today.
So almost 4 years into fatherhood. How is that working out for you?
It's a blast. The way that my work schedule, with me teaching remotely, a couple of graduate classes which meet weekly. Undergrad is all asynchronous, so I have lots and lots of time to hang out with little man. And especially that first year after he was born, we kept him home. I got to keep him. I was the main daytime caregiver, and I wouldn't trade that time for anything.
I remember when our first one was born, taking him home from the hospital. It had not struck yet that I was a dad. And I vividly remember getting him in the car seat and getting in the car. I've never been so nervous to drive. And I realized at that moment, you're a dad.
Yeah. It's a real thing, and both my wife and I are only children, and so we didn't have a lot of experience with being around younger siblings or having babies around, just in general. And so the first time I really spent much time with the baby was with my own, and again, going straight from basically zero experience to almost around the clock.
Yeah.
It was a real eye opener, but in a good way, and we're. Whether it's because we've just forgotten or just because children are a blessing, we're looking forward to round number 2 coming in November. Yeah. Ask me again in January, I may give you a somewhat different answer, but at least for the time being, we're pumped about it.
The second one is always good because you can do one-on-one at that point. It's when you add that third one that they outnumber you, so it becomes a little bit hairy.
I've heard it as the transition from man to man going to zone defense, where you're out personed all the way around.
Now, I got on good authority that I was supposed to ask you which John you went by, 1 John, 2 John, or 3 John.
Sure. Okay, so a little bit of backstory here. There were 3 Johns in our undergraduate college ministry, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and it was based on the order in which we joined that ministry or started attending that congregation. It was Northport Church of Christ originally. And so I am 2nd John.
Okay.
And 3rd John is actually now the minister over at Signal Mountain. And so we saw them at the aquarium this afternoon. I think they're supposed to be here tonight also visiting.
So did you refer to him still as 3rd John?
Occasionally we do. We actually still have a group text with the 3 of us. I've seen both of them within the last couple of months, and we still stay in touch. We were all at Alabama during some of the Saban heyday, those early years, and sports fandom, but also especially involvement in church. Couple of things that really tied us together, and so we all got matching New Testaments from the church we were part of at the time. Okay. So my New Testament says 2 John on the front. It's the world's longest copy of 2 John, but it's been a blessing to have those guys as friends now.
Okay, so and you are like an Alabama sports fan?
Yeah, I have to admit, I was actually an Auburn fan until I got my scholarship offer to go to Alabama as an undergrad.
Had to switch.
And it went at a very fortunate time because I got all 6 years of Auburn beating Alabama from the early 2000s on to 2007, and then was there in Tuscaloosa for all but 2 years of Saban's tenure there. Okay.
So it's not all like you're not all like research and study. There's another side of you that does involve some fun stuff.
Yeah, football fandom. Probably a U.S. soccer fan longer than anything else. Although I haven't kept up as much with that in the last few years since kiddo was born. But But it's been good. Yeah, I have that, and he's been getting into a little bit of Mario and Sonic and some of those kind of things.
Gotcha,
So we do a little bit of gaming together.
Yeah. Okay. So, John, we've got a lot of stuff to cover here. I'm so excited about talking to you about the book that you are here to talk about tonight as part of our Awaken conference. And so, but this is, I was mistaken. This is not your most recent book,
Sure.
correct?
Correct.
So you've got a book that just came out or is coming out, right?
One that just came out about 2 months ago.
Okay.
And it was probably the least serious book I've written, but the most fun I've had writing a book. So somewhat different from the book that I'll be talking about later this evening.
Okay. So let's just jump right in then to that book, because I'd like our audience to just get a flavor, a feel for some of your background, history, what drives you, your passion. So this book that you're going to be talking about tonight, redrawing the blueprints for the early church. What's the entire title?
Redrawing the Blueprints for the Early Church, Historical Ecclesiology in and Around the Stone Campbell Movement. And I think in humanity circles, sort of the expectation that you have a title, semi-title,
right,
and or subtitle rather, and then it's got to have some kind of fancy buzzword in there as well. So historical ecclesiology was the one that I chose for my project.
Okay, so right off the bat, because you've thrown a big word at us,
Sure.
ecclesiology. What does that word mean?
Yeah, so more broadly, ecclesiology is kind of the study or the consideration of the nature of the church. So things like how the church functions, its organization, governance, these kinds of concerns. The historical side of this relates to our kind of shared background in restoration churches, where we're always in some ways looking back in time. You know, we hold up Acts, we hold up the letters as kind of the normative for what we're striving for.
Right.
And so there's a historical element of this as well. What do we think the ecclesiology of that early church or first century church or New Testament church, whatever term we want to use, what do we think that church was like?
Yeah.
What's the mental the mental map or the mental image we have of the church that we are trying to restore it in the present day?
Gotcha. Yeah. So you've got some interest in here, because as I was looking at your bio and other stuff, I mean, this is your dissertation was related to
Yes.
this, right?
Yes.
So why do you have such a passion, such an interest in this particular subject?
So I actually came to the study of Churches of Christ, the Stone Campbell movement, relatively late, especially given that I'm a lifetime C of C'er.
Mm-hmm.
I went to undergrad at Alabama, history, political science, with the plan of going to law school.
Okay.
And I went to law school for about 3 months and realized I hated it. and so, I don't know if I'm the first law school dropout you've had on the podcast, but at least certainly the most recent one. But I quit law school before exams, and I didn't want to go through with that. And I loved the history coursework I had at Alabama as an undergrad. And I decided that was what I wanted to study, but I didn't really know quite what to do in terms of research. And even at the master's level, we would be expected to do a master's seminar paper, which kind of our stand-in for a thesis. And so I was casting around for an idea, and had kind of kicked a couple of things around. And one of them was the story of a guy named T.B. Larimore, who was a late 19th into the early 20th century Church of Christ minister, preacher, schoolmaster, who started Mars Hill Academy, now Mars Hill Bible School in Florence, where I live. And he had tried to start another school down in Gainesville, also a part of SEC country down there. But he had left this collection of papers related to that. Nobody had really done anything with them. And my at the time, girlfriend, now wife, bought me a copy of his memoirs, or his some of his letters, and a short biographical sketch. And that sort of turned me on to studying church history. I decided I was at least going to give that a whirl for the master's paper.
Okay.
And then from there, I had to do another research seminar at the PhD level. And then that became the core of the dissertation. One of the groups that I talk about in this Redrawing the Blueprints project, or in the book, was the subject of a research paper I did, like a 25, 30-page research paper for a graduate class. And it just kind of, I won't say it just kind of came to me, but it was very serendipitous that it worked out in this way.
Okay. So I'm assuming that there's some level of like fascination or passion regarding church history, and so I'm like, Why do you have a passion? I mean,
Sure.
some people are like, I have a passion for football, and I get that.
Yeah.
What is it that drives you about this particular subject matter?
Yeah. So I grew up, in Florence, Alabama, where I live now. Sort of have joked with other historians that it's sort of the third city among churches of Christ. You've got Nashville and Abilene, and then the Shoals areas in terms of concentration of churches. We're sort of right up there, kind of the Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem, perhaps of churches of Christ. And but despite growing up there, and despite going to a K-12 school, which was Church of Christ affiliated, Churches of Christ affiliated, I didn't really get much of the history, and I didn't really see a lot of reason for it. Okay. In other words, I did well in my history classes, did well in my Bible classes, but they seemed like very different kinds of pursuits to me.
Right.
And so for me as an instructor, as a professor of church history, and as someone who taught 2 sections of church history to 10th graders this past semester, I try to get students to see that where we are in our current moment, it has been shaped powerfully by the generations that came before us in ways that are sometimes bad, that sometimes are harmful, but also that there are riches, that there are treasures in our history. And I mean both in the sense of churches of Christ specifically, but also in the history of the broader Christian tradition. Yeah. And so I teach our early church class. I teach Reformation and Modern. I teach medieval church history for the undergrads. I teach a Stone Campbell Restoration class. And again, in a program or programs that I teach in where ministers, chaplains, so many pressing concerns that they face in their lines of work. Typically, my students are already working and then coming back to school for further training. It can be hard at times for them to just kind of naturally intuit that there's something here. It's like, in other words, if I know what I need to be doing now, why does it matter what someone 500 or 1,000 years ago did?
Right.
And what I really try to communicate is this idea that this church history as a subject is not just an academic pursuit. It can be kind of a spiritual discipline or something that is at least spiritually formative for us. We learn from the good, the bad, and the ugly of those who have preceded us. And not only do we find things that maybe we say, hey, I should try that, but also just the stories of courage, of inspiration, of perseverance in many cases. That biographical side can really be something for students to hang on to.
Yeah. So you've thrown out a couple names a couple times. So I know some of our listeners are not familiar with Alexander Stone or Campbell.
Yeah.
The Campbell Stone movement is you sometimes hear it referred to as that.
Yeah.
And I've had conversations with people who say, "Oh, the Church of Christ, those are your founding fathers."
Sure.
And is that a misconception? Is that a misstatement? Did the Church of Christ start because of those two guys, or does the Church of Christ go back to 33 AD?
So that's a good question, and the answer is, I guess, simultaneously both yes and no simultaneously to both of them. So again, kind of in one sense, as Christians, right, we look back to Pentecost as as Jesus told the disciples, wait for the signal, and then something great's going. I'm paraphrasing there. And something does happen that's wonderful at Pentecost, and we see Christians being added in. But here in the United States, where, for many of us, sitting here at a Church of Christ, I'm a lifelong member of congregations that have Church of Christ in the name. A lot of our specific background can be traced back to late 18th, early 19th movement, century churches, which formed themselves together in a movement. It was composed largely of people leaving different Christian denominations because of frustrations with certain kinds of practices or teachings or structures, who wanted to be, disciples of Christ or Christians. They sought those kinds of simple terms as self-descriptors. From there, those Christians often saw, even if they had some differences with each other, they often saw each other as kind of kindred spirits. Right. And so even for Stone, for Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell, those two guys didn't get along super great, which there's a certain irony that we refer to the movement as the Stone-Campbell movement. But many of those who are associated with them said, despite some of these differences that we have on some of these matters of secondary importance, we're trying to be Christians only. Yeah. Right? We're trying to point the way back to Jesus. Yeah. And so in that sense, we have an ancient history, and we also have a more modern, more recent history. And I teach both of those. I love teaching both of those. And for my students, if they are willing to struggle with me through the entire sequence of classes I offer, we find lots of points of comparison and contrast and things to think about from both sections of that history.
So these men, Stone and Campbell, were coming from a denominational background.
Yes.
And so there's some irony there that some people would argue that they were trying to get away from that, but they started is the Church of Christ a denomination? Should we call ourselves a denomination?
Yeah, there is a certain irony that a lot of so specifically for Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell both, at different times and for slightly different reasons, leaving Presbyterianism specifically. So Stone has some concerns. Even when he is ordained in the Presbyterian Church, he says he agrees with the Westminster Confession as far as it matches with the Word of God, and he just kind of barely squeaks through his ordination process. And for Campbell, there are some other reasons as well. And even those two guys didn't necessarily agree on what Christians should be called. Campbell was in favor of disciples of Christ. Barton Stone preferred either Christians only or the churches of Christ. And today, the heirs, right? If you kind of track churches, planning churches, and where ministers travel and kind of things, there are multiple fellowships of churches that descend in a kind of a spiritual heir sense from those guys. And that division is something that I think they would have had some trouble with, had they lived another century or so.
Because their overall, I think the thing that drove them was really just, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're the expert on this, was basically let's get back to the Bible and teach what the Bible teaches, and that's what we need to be focused on. Yeah,
so the way I think of it is that there's, two or arguably three kind of core goals that, Stone and the Campbells and some of those early other figures are really concerned with, and that's certainly, as you've talked about, restoration, the idea that we kind of look around in our own present moment. We see differences between what we're doing and what the early church did, and so we try to strip away some of that tradition. We try to bring something back from the ancient past, a kind of Christianity, to practice it in the present day. There was also a real concern for unity, the idea that that there are, as Campbell put it in a couple of different ways, but we are Christians only, perhaps, but not the only Christians, or that there are Christians in the other sects. But again, the goal was to unify all Christians into this body. And then finally, something that will sound a little bit maybe more unusual to those in churches of Christ today, we tend to take kind of an amillennial, or we don't necessarily read the section in Revelation 24 through 6 that talks about Jesus' millennial reign. We tend to read that in a figurative way. But many of the early founders thought that somehow their work in restoring the church and uniting Christians into it would help bring about some of those events. So
interesting.
And so, restoration, unity, and then the millennium in different levels for each of those. I do think there's a reason why restoration became the name of the movement, in terms of its kind of importance among the theologies of Stone and Campbell and many of the others. So again, it's just kind of making an end run around a lot of Christian history to try to get back to something that used to be there that we don't have today.
Have we moved closer or further away from what Stone and Campbell envisioned?
It's sort of a mixed bag, I would say. In some ways, I think there are a lot of things that we do that would be very familiar to them. The kind of the ways we organize congregations, the ways in which we do or perhaps don't work together, creating different kinds of structures. Outside of that, I think there's a lot of things, again, where they would find a lot of common cause, but at the same time, some of the kind of the trappings of the church that we have, which I think a lot of cases are very helpful kinds of things, would have seemed very unusual to them. I think also, especially for Stone, so Stone's involvement in kind of his path out of Presbyterianism starts at Cane Ridge, Kentucky. This massive communion festivals of the Scottish style, a weekend long, where there would be preaching, teaching, all sorts of kind of small groups of conversations and Bible studies going on. And then on Sunday, everybody, thousands of people would get together to take communion. And for Stone, again, he's coming from the Presbyterian Church. There are Baptists, there are Methodists there also. And, kind of the idea of this communion meeting is that everybody's going to take communion together, right? That despite these differences between kind of ordinations or creeds and denominations, they were there to take communion and to recognize one another as Christians. And so Stone's there. He's excited about this, and he sees it as kind of a step towards that unity that his employer doesn't see it that way. And so in some ways, our historical stance, of Churches of Christ against other churches might seem a little bit different than what some of the early restorers thought, where again, they were certainly concerned about restoring. Alexander Campbell, especially in his early years, could be very combative towards other Christian groups. But certainly by the end of their lives, both Stone and Campbell, again, while not discounting the work that they had done kind of in our movement, if you asked them, are there Christians in other groups, they would say yes. And then sometimes in Churches of Christ, we've been maybe a little bit more reluctant to go down that path.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things in your book, where you have this this Christadelphians Church of the Churches of Christ, the ICOC.
Yes.
So these groups that you've studied in their approach or their idea of restoring the early church differently. So can you talk a little bit about what you were trying to point out on that?
Yeah, so in a lot of writing about the restoration movement today, it tends to sort of boil down to the three largest groups, which they are certainly the largest. So the Churches of Christ, which we're familiar with, right? Independent Christian churches, and the Disciples of Christ, or sometimes referred to singularly as the Christian church. But there are a lot of other groups, smaller groups perhaps, that also in some way can trace their lineage back to some of these restoration, forebears that we would talk about, a Stone or a Campbell or, James O'Kelly, Elias Smith, some of these earlier guys as well. And so what I wanted to do in the book, on one hand, was bring in some different groups that haven't been under the microscope, so to speak, quite as often, and to show that, again, despite some of the differences in practice, and again, there are some very important differences in practice, that there is still that shared core idea of trying to be like the earliest Christians. That, again, we go about that in different ways, in part because I think we have different historical ecclesiologies. I'm going to throw my buzzword back out there. We have different ideas of what we are trying to restore, different understandings of what the first century church was like, but there is still some measure of common purpose across these groups, even though their understanding of what they're restoring, can lead to some very different places. So like if you look today, Christadelphian gatherings don't look a lot like International Churches of Christ. Worship services don't look a lot like non-institutional Churches of Christ services. And but there is still some shared DNA, spiritual DNA in there.
Yeah. So should we focus on the differences or the commonalities? On
That's sort of the classic historians, kind of get divided into two camps. Are you a lumper or a splitter? Is how I heard it framed when I was in grad school. Lumpers, and it's sort of an unfortunate term, but tend to be folks who look more for commonality, sort of like what's the big story in, when we go back and look through these historical documents. And so the kind of the lumper perspective would be to say, highlight the similarities. We're looking and seeing what is, what do all of these groups share? What's the common thread pulling all of them together? How can we put them into the same basket? Whereas the splitter approach would be more like, okay, if we look at Churches of Christ, we've got like mainstream churches, we've got non-institutional, we've got ICOC, we've got One Cup or Mutual Edification or and you could find all sorts of, tiny to moderate sized groups, and say, well, Churches of Christ are just hopelessly fragmented, and that would be sort of the divisive, focusing on the things that separate us. And so whether or not I was successful in this, what I tried to do in the book was to show that there is both.
Yeah.
That both of those perspectives matter, that on one hand, as an outsider to each of the groups that I've talked about, I can see some things that they share. On the other hand, these groups would generally not see themselves as in fellowship with each other. There may be practices that either they do or do not approve of, or teachings that they do or do not approve of. And so trying to be respectful of those beliefs as well. So it's trying to figure out what is there that unites them, whether or not they would acknowledge it, and what is there that separates them, whether or not they would see these as matters of first importance. Yeah. So that's a very mealy-mouthed answer to your question.
No, I'm noticing a theme here with, as I'm listening to you talk, and you've already noticed this yourself. I'm going off script because you're saying things that I'm like, oh, I want to track that down a little bit further. So I'm going to try to stay on it. I've got a lot of questions about what you just said, but I'm going to refrain, exercise discipline here, because there is some other good questions here I want to talk about that you talk about in your book, the 5 R's specifically: revelation, recalibration, replication, recursion, and repetition. What are those, and how do they come into play?
So each of the different chapters of the book have kind of a parallel word or theme. And I will say necessity is sometimes the mother of invention. I went to my dissertation proposal meeting with my committee. They were really excited about what I was proposing, but they hated my chapter organization because I had originally thought I'll do a chapter on each of these 4 groups, and then have an intro and a conclusion, and we'll call it a day. And despite their different backgrounds, I had a medieval history professor, Civil War guy. I had a couple of religious history professors as well. They all came back and like, we love this, but the chapter organization's got to go. We need something more thematic in nature. And so, I kind of cast around for a little bit. But one of the things that I noticed first when I started getting into this study of historical ecclesiology, as I called it, was that sometimes for restorationist groups, and I think we in Churches of Christ have done this ourselves at times, the recursion piece. So recursion is where a thing is defined basically in terms of itself. It's originally like a mathematics, computer science, linguistics term that people in those fields probably would not agree with how I use the term in the book, but it's this idea that we start defining ourselves based on our own history rather than on the history of the early church. So again, restoration churches, right? Our goal is to try to be like the New Testament church. But sometimes we hold up golden ages from our own history as, it's like the 1950s. If we could just evangelize like the 1950s, or if we just were, defenders of truth like the Campbells had, were 200 years ago, or whatever kind of idol we create in our head, we are then a restoration movement. But what we're trying to restore is actually something from our own specific history. Yeah. And so, I started looking about what were some of the other, main themes. I did have to get a little creative with some of the word choices as well, but I wanted to keep the parallel structure again of having, all the words start with R, and it's some kind of process that's ongoing. And so recursion, repetition, these kinds of things. And again, it was something that I was not super happy with the committee at first, but I think it pushed me in directions that I probably wouldn't have gone otherwise, and hopefully came out with a better, more insightful project as a result.
Yeah. And I'm thinking here too, as you're talking about, the goal is to go back and try to get as close to the church that Jesus establishes while he's here. And obviously, that's been over 2,000 years ago, so we're pretty far removed from that. But each window of time, each generation has their very limited purview of their worldview that's shaped and fomented based on pretty recent things that have taken place. Sure. And so to your point, if we could just go back and do things the way they did in the 1950s, I mean, that's relatively close into our own culture. And we just make assumptions, I think, that we make assumptions that, they're my elders, they knew what they were doing, and they were just duplicating what was obviously taking place in the first century.
Right.
And so we just, we hang our hat on that and we run with it. And I don't know, that may not be the greatest thing to do.
Yeah. And I think it's just, it's not one of those things where you certainly am not interested in like slinging mud at our forebears.
Yeah.
But I remember growing up and at least occasionally hearing, references made about like, Barton Stone, his, being held up in high regard because of his preference for the name Churches of Christ, right? He was big on that. And, again, as a lifetime member of Churches of Christ, we'd often hear him being spoken of highly in that regard. But, he also had some somewhat different teachings about the nature of the Godhead than what we would find today. There were certainly other issues where he would be, kind of maybe out of step. Alexander Campbell was known as a post-millennialist. Again, he thought that this restoration movement was going to help bring about Jesus' millennial reign. And, thinking about in his own day and age, those kinds of ideas were much more common. And Campbell was not alone in this. And, perhaps by the end of his life had maybe kind of mellowed a little bit on that. But again, it's just recognizing that, our forebears, our kind of ancestors in the faith, they were people, right? And they got a lot of things right. And they also had some things where they would probably disagree with or differ than us. And that's true throughout our history. History, when you really study, when you really dive into the lives of people, it surprises you, right? If you're really paying close attention to someone with all of their experiences and just the nuances of that individual's life, people will surprise you. Yeah. And it's easy for us to kind of codify an image of like, oh, the 1950s were like this, or the 1900s were like this, and the historical experience really is just much more complex and much more rich than that.
And I'm going down this road because I'm setting up this next question that I want to ask you, and I want to give that a little bit more depth here for those listening, because I think this is an important distinction that we make. And you mentioned, the name Churches of Christ. I've literally had conversations with people that say, if they can't get the name right on the building, I'm not walking inside of that thing. And Campbell and Stone could have just as easily said, you know what, we're going to call ourselves the Way. Yeah. That's a scriptural term to call the church. So is the Church of God. So there, it's not. We get stuck so much on maybe what these guys. Well, to your point, it's like we've looked at these guys. They're up on a pedestal, and then we do a little research and we find out this is my hero, and they were human, and they sometimes got things not maybe where we would draw those conclusions from. So all of that to say, John, in your research, did you find that these movements are more historically informed or more ideologically selective in their use of early church models?
Sure. So again, one of the outside of Restoration Movement historians, there are also historians who look at American religion or American churches who have written about the Restoration Movement. And one of the things that comes up in a lot of that literature, even though it has its helpful insights, is kind of this assumption that restorationist churches, or another term for us is it can be used as primitivist churches. We were trying to be like the primitive church or the early church. Yeah. That is sometimes used as kind of a slam. Yeah. In other words, it's not always meant in a complimentary sense, because there is this assumption that people in Church of Christ, they think it's like this. Like the early church was this time outside of time, is just sort of mythic era, and we don't really have like a good grasp on the history of it. And what I want to try to show in the book is that there actually is, within Churches of Christ, within this broader Restoration Movement heritage, and actually a very large number of historians and scholars who have focused their attention on the history of the early church. Several major patristic scholars of the church fathers have come from our religious fellowship as well. Does that always get translated out to the pew? Maybe or maybe not. Mm-hmm. But it is to show that there is a greater attention to historical detail kind of in the broad sweep of the Restoration Movement than we often get credit for. Historically, sometimes people in Churches of Christ are seen as sort of rubes, or kind of the country bumpkins of the American Christian world. I think it's an unfair characterization, and we've had some really top flight historians and biblical scholars come out of our fellowship. But even, and this is kind of bringing it a little bit closer to the present day, I remember seeing it in exchange between Scott McKnight, biblical scholar, not member of Churches of Christ, but speaking about Churches of Christ, and just being amazed at like the biblical knowledge, like sort of the biblical interest of members of Churches of Christ. And I think when we see those perspectives for people who don't have a dog in the race, don't have a horse in the race, that should be acknowledged too. That there is something good here. That biblical focus. And a biblical focus informed by historical considerations, I think is a real strength of where we are.
So are we done with, like, is the Restoration movement? We look back at that time and we're like, it shook up a lot of people's way of thinking, and it was a pretty big movement. And has all the dust settled on that? And should we, as members of the Church of Christ, be like, okay, we've finally got it kind of figured out, and we fall out where we fell out, and or does the Restoration movement continue? Are we still?
Yeah, that's a question that has been going kind of in the water since the early days of the Restoration movement itself. Alexander Campbell and Walter Scott, who was another early restorer, a friend of his, contemporary of his. Best known for the 5 fingers for 5 steps of salvation, little memory jogger. Yeah. We can return to that later if we want to.
We could probably say it together, you and I, on count.
But Scott's was actually different. It had 6 fingers originally. Not as easy to use. But even they disagreed with each other over, like, when the first restored gospel sermon was preached, or like when the church was itself restored. And, when those early guys don't even agree on, like, sort of what's the implication of this for today. But of course for us, we're 200 years on from a lot of those early figures in our specific corner of the Christian world, or of Christendom. What do we do with that? Is it just kind of mission accomplished and we just kind of write it out and we keep doing the same things until Jesus returns, or we die, or whatever? Or is there still work to be done with that? And again, if even just within churches of Christ, you see congregations answering that question in different ways, where, for some it is very much a, once this has been restored, and it is now our job to preserve something. We are thankful for the work of the restorers, but now it's our job to kind of keep doing the same things. Whereas, perhaps other churches would say, well, they got a lot right, but we still have things, we still have a current ministry context that we've got to be cognizant of. Maybe there are things that they missed, or things that they didn't restore, or that maybe they got and we've kind of dropped the ball along the way, and maybe we need more restoration today. It's as a historian, I tend to be a little bit less in terms of, like, prescriptive of, like, which of these is the right approach, but but just in thinking of our history, members of churches of Christ have been struggling with that question about as long as we've existed, and the answers we have come up with have been about as varied as you could imagine.
Is there anything that we've kind of cemented, Church of Christ at large, that we've looked at from a restorational standpoint and said, this is now codified? I mean, we're not going to touch this. It's clearly, all the scholars agree, this was a foundational stone that basically Jesus laid down. We can't, and the early church, they followed that and they didn't change it.
Yeah, it's interesting because you kind of look at the broader Christian world, and even within churches of Christ, there is so much variation on seemingly, like, every possible issue that you could think of. Is like, is there a there that is, that's bad grammar, but is there something there that you can actually call, like, Church of Christ singular? Because it is so, is so varied. Thinking about, like, kind of external scholarship, I mean, I think it's pretty universally agreed that the earliest Christians, used a cappella worship, or worshipped in an a cappella style, for several centuries prior to that changing. And again, whether that is, prescriptive for us, or and again, I'm a lifelong a cappella guy, even folks who would not see that as something to be bound on the church would say, well, the earliest centuries, it was a cappella worship. Similarly, I'm just thinking about this because teaching a early church history graduate class right now, and we spent some time with this. You see the development in church history of the monoepiscopacy pretty early. So, like, the idea that instead of having a plurality of elders, in a congregation, you have, like, a bishop singular who is kind of the lead figure in a congregation. Even by, like, the 2nd century, that's a very common practice. There are in the collection of writings known as the Apostolic Fathers. So basically, like, first generation of Christians after the New Testament. including some disciples of the disciples. And so in the letters of Ignatius, which make up a large chunk of this, he is always concerned with the well-being of these churches. They're facing all different kinds of heresies and things. And he says, listen to the bishop, singular, right? So there's been a lot of emphasis on, basically we have seemingly plural church governance in the New Testament. By the 2nd century, it's all, you've got one bishop, right? But there are also places in those same contemporary documents, the writings of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John the Apostle, and he writes to the Philippians just as Paul had, and is implying and talking about a plurality of leaders in the church, elders, deacons, being involved in that work. And so, again, even though the kind of the singular bishop, for a congregation and then eventually singular bishop for a city does take hold over those coming centuries, there has, I think, been kind of a larger recognition that the idea of a plurality of elders or kind of a plurality in church government, church governance, church offices, whatever word we think is most appropriate there, has been a helpful thing. And I think really outside of, I don't want to get too far out of my skis here, but I think outside of some of the 1990s ICOC kind of hierarchy building in that decade, we pretty much have stuck to congregational governance by elders, across the board. And I think that's one of those things that, a lot of churches today are, I think, seeing some wisdom in that.
Speaking of that, now I'm fixing to go. I said I wasn't going to do this, but I can't help because you've piqued my interest.
Sure.
Within the churches of Christ, you see female leadership emerging and an argument being made for that. And how does that jive with the early church fathers, and why is that such a thing? I mean, are we just so beholden to our current cultures, or is this a movement that we need to be pursuing?
Yeah, I mean, it's, you see kind of within churches of Christ today, maybe a few congregations appointing women as elders. I think more common has been for congregations to appoint elder teams of husband and wife. And so, again, where it's not necessarily like a specific, person being an elder, it has been in our history in the Restoration Movement, that has been an unusual thing to do, I will say. But, 200 years ago, through much of the 19th century, it was not at all uncommon for women to serve as deacons, especially in the churches that were maybe more closely associated with Barton Stone. Women as song leaders, I can say that, even into the early 20th century in churches of Christ, I can think of at least a couple of examples of prominent ministers who would travel around to do the preaching, and if they couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, then their wife would be the one that would essentially function as the song leader when they would travel. And so, again, does the fact that it happened in our history make it a good thing or a bad thing? Well, that's maybe sort of a separate question, but it is just to say that the history, even within our little corner of the broader 2,000 years of the Christian world, is a little bit more variable, a little more variated than we might anticipate, based off of what we see kind of most churches of Christ doing today.
Okay. So what do we do with like Paul's admonition on those types of things? Like, does he supersede anything else that we have? I mean, do we look for him as like talking about restoration, going back to first century and following what his guidance is on that? Yeah.
And so again, thinking here about like the descriptions of qualifications for elders, deacons, and again, writing to Timothy and Titus about that. I think where you see kind of the biggest question mark, or if not question mark, but kind of point of pushback on that is that the place of Phoebe. And again, that is a very difficult thing because Phoebe is described as being a diakonos, a word that is translated both as deacon and servant. And so, if you look at the criteria where Paul is talking and saying, elders, husband of one wife, deacon, kind of same idea there, that would seem to imply that those offices are held by men. But then if we look at Phoebe and she's described as a diakonus, if we would say, well, maybe she is a deacon, and then maybe Paul's writings would be, maybe he just means like spouse of one spouse, right? Mm-hmm. That's how the debate sort of breaks down on that. If you look at the Phoebe verse and say, okay, she is a deacon, therefore we must read these other passages as if it's spouse of one spouse. But if we start with the husband of one wife, and then we look at Phoebe, who's described as a diakonos, then we would say that must just mean a servant, rather than like a deacon in the sense of Paul's writings to Timothy and Titus, or what we see in Acts 6. And again, in Churches of Christ specifically, you can find both of those views being articulated. I think, broadly speaking, the much more common view would be that Paul's writings are kind of the norm there, and that Phoebe must have just been a servant of some sort rather than a deacon or a deaconess in that way. But again, that's where you would find some of the current debate over that practice.
You do have to, wherever you fall out on that, you have to admire the scholarship of the scholars within the Churches of Christ who use a pattern of logic that there are some mental gymnastics going through, but using the ladder of that, because then you end up with some weird stuff that you have to do with Paul, and it doesn't seem to align. So
that's and it's we don't turn this into necessarily a hermeneutics conversation, but again, commands, examples, necessary, inferences. Determining which inferences are necessary in some instances is a little more of a difficulty than we might at first think. Yeah.
So we're running out of time. I do have a few more questions that I want to ask you before we are completely out of time. Has writing this book changed your view on the early church and your own ecclesial tradition?
Sure. So again, I was writing in this book not about Churches of Christ specifically. I have written books about where I am in the kind of the Restoration Movement heritage, but thinking about some groups that are in a lot of ways like mine, and in a lot of ways not like mine, has given me, I think, a better sense of graciousness towards those groups that I disagree with. Again, not that I agree with them necessarily, because again, as I said, disagree on a lot of points with, but a recognition that there is a shared goal there. Yeah. I think it has also instilled a good bit of humility, and I think as a historian, that's an important characteristic. We're further back in time you go, typically the less documentation you have. The further closer you get to the present, the more documentation you have, but it can be so overwhelming that you couldn't possibly ever, tell a complete story, because there's just so much paper, so much data today. That as a historian, humility is an important criteria, because we want to try to acknowledge, hey, I'm coming to the table with these biases. I have these limitations. I only have 24 hours in a day like everybody else. And I'm going to try to tell the most honest history I can, but acknowledging that, again, I am a very fallible person, and that I may mess things up also. And that goes for, again, my understanding of what the early church was like. Right there, I may have an image, and I may study a lot, and I have an idea of this is what I think New Testament Christianity really is about. And I might find out, at some point in the future that, like, okay, I missed some big things along the way. And I think just that stance of humility is one that we can all benefit from, not even just as historians, but just as members of a body that's trying to pull something from history and bring it to the present day. We are all functioning as historians when we read about the past, when we try to understand what was normative for that day and what is normative for ours, and to try to bring something to the present. We are all doing the work of historians, even if you didn't like history in high school, right? We are still doing history. Yeah.
Man, there's so much more I wish we had time. This is like a 3-part podcast. This is to really, get into some of this stuff that I wish we had time to get into. All right, so just in some closing things, a few announcements we want to make. Our Awaken Chattanooga conference that's going on now. You're the speaker at that tonight. We're so excited and glad to have you here to talk to us about that. If it's anything like this podcast, I know I'm going to be very interested in what you have to say.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And I thought about making a joke about acting really surprised that I was supposed to be speaking here, speaking here in an hour. But no, I'm looking forward to it, and just have been really encouraged this month. Every Wednesday this month, I've been at a different church speaking about Restoration Movement history in some capacity, and it is just really I think a blessing to the people of those congregations, not to get to hear me specifically, but that their church leaders, their elders, their ministers are taking seriously the need for us to be historically grounded.
Yeah,
and so I would definitely want to commend Central for that.
Awesome. Yeah, we appreciate it. And so speaking of our Awaken conference, it's going to continue next week with another author by the name of Joe Wells. He's written Connected, Parenting Faithfully in the Digital Age. So I think that's going to be a relevant topic for any parent especially, but even if you're not a parent, we all have our digital technology addictions that we need to think about. I want to plug our other show that comes out of this studio after Sunday, Digging Deeper, that airs every Monday, a brief 15-minute overview of the lesson. They take my lesson on Sundays and actually make it worth listening to in 15 minutes. So tune into that. It's a co-host. They do a great job on that. Also, shout out to our sponsor, Ministry League, who is just such a great resource for so many things. If you haven't downloaded that app, you can see the QR code right there on your screen. You can go ahead and download that. And since we've got you on the show, John, we're going to pull up your book. So a copy of your book is going to be shown on the screen now. If you'd like to order that book, it's available on Amazon. And so, again, the name of the book, Redrawing the Blueprints for the Early Church. You take the second half of that after the colon.
Historical ecclesiology in and around the Stone Campbell movement.
Great. Always like to close out the show with a scripture that the guest will share, whatever's close to you. So go ahead and...
Sure. There's something to be said about historians being kind of long-winded, not only in our titles, but... the passage that I'm thinking of for tonight is not exactly a single verse that I want to read, but rather it's a reminder that the entirety of the book of Deuteronomy, we tend to think of this as kind of a second giving of the law, and it is, but a lot of it, really the frame of the entirety of the book is, as the Israelites are getting ready to enter the Promised Land, Moses parks the bus for just a minute and turns into a history lecture. Again, remember, this is where we've been, this is where we're going, but this is where we've been. When you go into this land, remember who you've been and remember whose you are. There are certainly cautions and warnings to the Israelites about the consequences of their failure to worship or to stay true to God. But so much of it is historically grounded, and of course, we know this is Moses' last speech, right? He pretty much gets done with it and goes up on the mountain and dies. Yeah. And I think there's something to this idea that someone who was as well trained and as intelligent as anybody that we read about in Scripture, right? His last words, his parting words, were a "remember where we've been, so you know where you are going," kind of thing. And so. Not every page of Deuteronomy is exactly a page turner, but keep that in mind next time you read. Think about it from a historical lens and try to apply those same principles in general to your own life.
Great. Thank you. Until our next podcast of The Lion, the Way, and the War, be kind to another one and love one another. Remember, the Creator of the universe loves you so much. He gave His only Son for you. Have a blessed day.